Joe Biden's idea is we're going to keep spending money up the wazoo, and somehow this is going to check inflation?
These disruptions are temporary. You can't flip the global economic light back on and not expect this to happen.
Joe Biden continues to wish away inflation. There are a lot of people, including Janet Yellen, who are saying that inflation is going to maintain for several more months at this point. Now, as I've been saying, there are two forces that are at work in the American economy. One is Joe Biden blowing dollars into the American economy, artificially lowering the labor rate because people are literally staying out of work because they're being paid to stay home, and artificially inflating the price of goods because we have a bunch of bottlenecks in all the distribution systems. And that's being exacerbated by money chasing fewer goods, which leads to price inflation. All of this rooted in the notion that somehow equity is achieved if you just helicopter cash to people, which has never been the case anywhere in history. Okay, so Joe Biden is saying that that's not raising inflation. No. You're crazy. You might be looking at that inflation rate and saying to yourself, wait a second, the prices are up, aren't they? He says, no. Nobody, no one is suggesting unchecked inflation is on the way, says our garrulous president.
There's nobody suggesting there's unchecked inflation on the way. No serious economist. That's totally different. I mean, look, the stock market is higher than it has been in all of history, even when it's down this month. Even down this month. Now, I don't look at the stock market as a means by which to judge the economy like my predecessor did. But he'd be talking to you every day for the last 5 months about how the stock market is so high, higher than any time in history, still higher than any time in history. So that's not how I judge whether or not we have economic growth.
Oh, well, he's going to judge you by the stock market. Weird, he wasn't doing that when Trump was president, but that's always the way that this works. Then Joe Biden follows up that doozy by suggesting that the inflation is temporary. And in fact, you know how you were going to solve inflation? We're going to solve inflation by artificially boosting the growth. Okay, this is like the dumbest thing, economically speaking, that I've heard recently. His theory is that inflation is going up. So if you blow more money into the economy, that will jog the spending, which will eventually bring the inflation down, which is a hell of a take. That's a hot take. Bull move there, Cotton.
Our experts believe, and the data shows, that most of the price increases we've seen were expected and are expected to be temporary. Reality is you can't flip the global economic light back on and not expect this to happen. As demand returns, there's going to be global supply chain challenges. We've seen that in semiconductors, which are used in automobiles. That global shortage has slowed vehicle production, creating a temporary spike in car prices. That's a real challenge. My administration will do everything we can to address it. But again, these disruptions are temporary.
Okay, you know what would be temporary is if you didn't artificially boost the money supply. It would have been temporary. There was going to be a natural economic recovery. Go back, listen to my podcast last year. I said when this was over, there'd be a major economic boom because the economy was doing great, and then it was put into an artificial coma, and now the artificial coma is ending, maybe, if the left will allow it to end, and people are going to go out and they're going to spend again. In fact, people ended last year with more net savings than they had the year before because the government had already put so much money in their pocket. Joe Biden's idea is we're going to keep spending money up the wazoo, and somehow this is going to check inflation. Interesting idea. Now, the reality is that when you remove this much money from the private economy and when everybody understands that the regulatory schemes that Biden is pursuing will hurt business and that taxation is eventually going to be around the corner, when everybody realizes that, the next move is that the economy starts to stagnate. It's what we call secular stagnation. We've seen it in Japan. Japan was the country that was going to take over the world in the 1980s. If you go back and you watch Die Hard in like 1989, 1990, if you go back and you watch Die Hard, what you'll see is that the Nakatomi Plaza, right, the whole metaphor is supposed to be that Japan was a great threat to the United States. They were going to be taking over all of our businesses, taking over the world, economically speaking. And then they went into full on like a decade of secular stagnation because they'd inflated their currency. And it turns out that the demand was not keeping up with anything remotely approaching the supply. So what you ended up with was this sort of very slow rate of growth that destroyed the Japanese growth and boom of the 1980s. By the 1990s, Japan had basically burned out. You could see exactly the same thing here. And Joe Biden's own administration is foreseeing this, by the way. You wonder why they're trying to distract with things like all Republicans are Jim Crow, Donald Trump, January. The reason they're doing that is because they all know that within 2 years, secular stagnation is likely to set in. And we're going to be growing not at 7% in an artificially boosted rebound from a pandemic, from an artificial coma. what's most likely is that in a couple of years, we're going to be growing at like 1.8%, 2%. In fact, if you look at Joe Biden's own 10-year proposed budget, that budget suggests that in just a couple of years, we're going to spend the rest of the decade growing at exorbitantly low levels. Very, very low levels. The reason that countries grow at very low levels is because they have put too many burdens on the actual entrepreneurs and job creators in their economy. It's because they've made it difficult to do business in their economy. Joe Biden doesn't care about that because he understands that the way that politics works is that the bigger the things you get done are, the less it matters whether they actually succeed. One of the great annoyances that I have with regard to historians is the way that they treat, for example, the 1920s, which were a boom time in the United States, as some sort of horrible time for American governance, and the 1930s, which was the Great Depression, as a wonderful time for American governance. Why? Because political history buffs are people who are interested in action. They're interested in action. And if a president does big things, it doesn't matter that they're a complete failure. LBJ, very important president, complete failure. FDR, very, very important president, absolute failure on virtually every level except for the handling of World War II. Okay, FDR's handling of the Great Depression was egregiously bad. And there's a great hilarity to the fact that presidential historians rate Herbert Hoover super low, but FDR super high, when FDR literally did what Herbert Hoover did, except a little more. In fact, everybody in the FDR administration acknowledged that they were doing what Herbert Hoover did. The reason that Herbert Hoover is treated with disdain and FDR with glory is because FDR, of course, was a Democrat and Herbert Hoover was a Republican. But the best presidents of the 20th century, at least up until Ronald Reagan, the best presidents of the 20th century were the presidents of the early 20s. William Harding, Calvin Coolidge. And these are the people who are disdained. How do I know that they were good presidents? Look at the economic growth rates from 1920 to 1929. Massive. And if you say, well, look at the Great Depression, that was 1920. Yes, that's true, because the reaction to the Great Depression was not to sit there and wait for it to peter out. Instead, the reaction to the stock market crash of October 1929 was to get government involved in extremely invasive ways in American life. Okay, but this again goes to why Joe Biden is doing any of this. Because if you're Joe Biden, the incentives for politicians, and this is true for members of Congress, it's true for senators, it's true for presidents, the incentive structure is to get big things done. And this is the problem with centralizing this much power in the hands of government. Whether you're talking about the public health establishment, where the incentive is to control, centralize, and quote unquote get things done, or whether you're talking about in the financial sphere, where the incentive is to control and centralize and quote unquote get things done. The first rule of politics and public health should be very simple. Do no harm. But that's not the political incentive. The political incentive is do something. You see this all the time. When people talk politics, they'll say, yeah, I see a problem. Why can't we just do something? Just do something. We should be treating politics like a doctor would treat a patient. The first rule is don't kill the patient. Do no harm. And yet that is precisely the opposite of our modern incentive structure, particularly in the media, where people who are the most activist are considered the most thoughtful and the greatest leaders. Why Andrew Cuomo was a hero while killing all the olds in his state, while Ron DeSantis, who basically restricted his action to protecting the elderly, was considered some sort of horrific human rights violator by the left. We need to change our mindset with regard to what government is designed to do. Otherwise, we are just going to get endless government quote-unquote action that brings about precisely the opposite of that which it intends to bring about. I know what you're thinking. It's time to binge some more Ben Shapiro videos. Well, you are right. You should. But first, like and subscribe. Perfect. I'll see you in the next video.